On a humid morning in the jungles of Guadalcanal in late 1942, an American Marine found a leaflet lying near his foxhole. The paper showed a beautiful woman and an elegant dress dancing with a well-dressed man in what appeared to be an expensive nightclub. The text, written in English, asked the Marine to imagine his girlfriend back home, dancing with men who had avoided military service while he suffered in the jungle fighting Japan's war. The leaflet suggested that while he risked his life, others were enjoying the pleasures he had left behind, that his sacrifice was foolish, and that he should consider whether continuing to fight was worth the cost. The Marine read the leaflet, laughed, and showed it to his squadmates, who also found it amusing rather than demoralizing. They kept it as a souvenir, one of thousands of Japanese propaganda leaflets that American and Allied forces would encounter throughout the Pacific War. These leaflets represented Japan's systematic psychological warfare campaign designed to break Allied morale by exploiting homesickness, fear, and doubt. But the campaign largely failed, producing effects opposite to those intended, as Allied soldiers collected the leaflets as curiosities, mocked their crude attempts at psychological manipulation, and used them to reinforce their determination to defeat an enemy who understood them so poorly. This is the story of how Japanese leaflets tried to break Allied morale, but instead revealed fundamental Japanese misunderstandings of their enemies, how psychological warfare requires cultural insight that Japan lacked, and how propaganda can backfire when it's based on projecting your own values onto an enemy who doesn't share them. The foundation of Japanese psychological warfare through leaflets was built on Japan's own military culture and on assumptions about human nature that reflected Japanese values but did not accurately represent how American, British, Australian, and other Allied soldiers actually thought and felt. Japanese military culture emphasized loyalty to the emperor and to the nation above individual life, viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace worse than death, and understood warfare in terms of honor and spirit that transcended material considerations. Japanese propagandists designing leaflets for Allied audiences projected these values onto their enemies, assuming that Allied soldiers shared similar concepts of honor, similar fears of disgrace, and similar priorities. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that Japanese leaflets often emphasized themes that resonated with Japanese psychology, but that Allied soldiers found either incomprehensible or laughable. The production of Japanese propaganda leaflets was surprisingly sophisticated in technical terms, even as the content revealed cultural tone deafness. Japan established specialized propaganda units within their military structure responsible for creating psychological warfare materials, including leaflets. These units employed artists who created illustrations for leaflets, writers who composed the English and other language text, and printing facilities that produced millions of leaflets throughout the war. The technical quality of the leaflets varied, with some showing professional artwork and printing, while others were crude. But overall, the production capabilities were substantial. The distribution mechanisms were diverse and showed creativity, with leaflets dropped from aircraft over Allied positions, fired in artillery shells that would burst above Allied lines and scatter leaflets, left in locations where advancing Allied forces would find them, and even delivered by agents or sympathizers in areas where such operations were possible. The content themes of Japanese leaflets fell into several categories, each designed to exploit different aspects of what Japanese propagandists believed would demoralize Allied soldiers. Homesickness and infidelity themes were perhaps most common, with leaflets showing or describing wives and girlfriends supposedly being unfaithful while soldiers were away, other men enjoying the women and pleasures that soldiers had left behind, and the futility of fighting in distant jungles while life continued without them at home. These themes assumed that Allied soldiers were primarily motivated by personal relationships and material pleasures, and that threats to these would undermine their will to fight. The crude sexual imagery and explicit suggestions of infidelity that appeared in many leaflets reflected Japanese assumptions about what would affect enemy morale, but actually often offended Allied soldiers who found the suggestions insulting to their families and who responded with anger rather than demoralization. Death and suffering themes emphasized the dangers Allied soldiers faced, the casualties they were taking, the diseases they would contract in tropical climates, and the ultimate futility of continuing to fight against Japan's supposedly invincible forces. Leaflets would list Allied casualties, describe horrible deaths that awaited soldiers, and suggest that surrender was the only rational choice to avoid pointless death. However, these themes often backfired because they contradicted Allied soldiers' actual combat experiences. When leaflets claimed Japanese invincibility, while Allied forces were actually winning battles and advancing across the Pacific, soldiers recognized the propaganda as false. The emphasis on death and suffering sometimes reinforced Allied soldiers' determination to fight harder rather than demoralizing them, as it confirmed the evil nature of an enemy who would try to frighten them into surrender. Racial themes appeared in Japanese leaflets targeting different Allied forces, with content adapted for American, British, Australian, and other nationalities and races. Leaflets targeting American forces sometimes attempted to exploit racial tensions within the United States, suggesting that African American and other minority soldiers were fighting for a country that discriminated against them, and questioning why they would risk their lives for such a nation. Leaflets targeting white Allied soldiers sometimes used racist imagery and language describing Asians, assuming that racial prejudice would make Allied soldiers sympathetic to Japanese racial ideology. These racial themes demonstrated Japanese propagandists' incomplete understanding of Allied societies and values. While racial tensions certainly existed in Allied countries, Japanese attempts to exploit them were generally too crude and too misaligned with how Allied soldiers actually thought about race to be effective. Surrender appeals were another major category of Japanese leaflet content, directly encouraging Allied soldiers to give up fighting and promising humane treatment as prisoners. These leaflets would describe the comfort and safety of surrender, would claim that the war was already lost for the Allies and that continued fighting was pointless, and would provide instructions for how to surrender safely. Some leaflets included safe conduct passes that soldiers could supposedly present to Japanese forces to ensure they were not harmed when surrendering. However, these surrender appeals failed almost entirely because Japanese military brutality toward prisoners, knew about atrocities committed by Japanese forces, and understood that surrender to Japanese forces often meant torture and death rather than the humane treatment promised in leaflets. The disconnect between leaflet promises and actual Japanese treatment of prisoners destroyed the credibility of surrender appeals. The distribution of Japanese leaflets reached massive scale, with millions of leaflets produced and distributed throughout the Pacific theater over the course of the war. Aerial distribution was most common, with Japanese aircraft flying over Allied positions at night and dropping bundles of leaflets that would scatter over wide areas. This method could reach large numbers of soldiers, but was imprecise and often resulted in leaflets landing in areas where Allied forces couldn't access them, or where environmental conditions like rain and humidity destroyed them before soldiers found them. Artillery distribution used special shells designed to burst above Allied positions and release leaflets, allowing more targeted distribution but limiting the number of leaflets that could be delivered. Ground distribution involved Japanese soldiers leaving leaflets in areas they were withdrawing from or placing them where advancing Allied forces would encounter them, a method that could ensure leaflets reached their intended audience, but that was limited in scale. The Allied soldiers' actual responses to Japanese leaflets were complex and revealed much about Allied military culture and morale. Many soldiers collected the leaflets as souvenirs, finding them amusing or interesting as examples of enemy propaganda. The sexual imagery in some leaflets made them popular collectibles for reasons opposite to what Japanese propagandists intended, with soldiers joking about the leaflets rather than being demoralized by them. Some soldiers used leaflets for practical purposes, like cigarette papers or toilet paper when other materials were scarce, a fate for Japanese propaganda that was both ironic and humiliating. Military intelligence collected leaflets systematically to analyze Japanese propaganda techniques and to understand Japanese psychological warfare strategies, creating archives that would later be valuable for historians studying the Pacific War. The Allied military authorities' responses to Japanese leaflets evolved from initial concern to eventual dismissiveness as the ineffectiveness of Japanese psychological warfare became apparent. Early in the Pacific War, Allied commands worried that Japanese propaganda might affect morale and implemented policies about handling enemy propaganda materials. Soldiers were sometimes instructed to turn in Japanese leaflets to intelligence officers rather than keeping them, and there were occasional warnings about enemy psychological warfare. However, as it became clear that Japanese leaflets were having no demoralizing effect and were actually sources of entertainment for soldiers, Allied authorities relaxed restrictions and sometimes even encouraged the collection of leaflets as intelligence materials. Some Allied units conducted their own analysis of Japanese leaflets, studying them to understand Japanese psychology and propaganda methods. The intelligence value of Japanese leaflets to Allied forces was actually more significant than their intended propaganda value. Analysis of leaflets provided insights into Japanese military thinking, revealing how Japanese understood their enemies and what Japanese believed would affect Allied morale. The themes emphasized in leaflets showed Japanese priorities and values, offering windows into Japanese military culture. Changes in leaflet content over time reflected Japanese assessments of the war's progress and Japanese evolving understanding of their situation. Leaflets sometimes contained information about Japanese military units or operations that Allied intelligence could use. Even the production quality and distribution methods provided intelligence about Japanese capabilities and resources. Allied intelligence services valued captured Japanese leaflets as intelligence sources more than they worried about them as threats to morale. The comparison between Japanese and Allied psychological warfare reveals fundamental differences in approach and effectiveness that reflected broader differences in how the two sides understood modern warfare. Allied psychological warfare, particularly operations conducted by the United States Office of War Information and British Political Warfare Executive, was generally more sophisticated and more effective than Japanese efforts. Allied propagandists invested heavily in understanding enemy psychology and culture, employed social scientists and area specialists who could provide cultural insights, tested propaganda messages to assess effectiveness, and adapted content based on feedback and results. Japanese psychological warfare lacked this level of sophistication and cultural intelligence, relying more on assumptions and projections than on systematic understanding of enemy psychology. The result was that Allied propaganda often succeeded in affecting enemy morale, while Japanese propaganda generally failed. The role of racism and cultural prejudice in shaping Japanese psychological warfare is important to understand, as it explains much about why Japanese leaflets failed. Japanese military culture included racist attitudes toward other Asian peoples and toward Westerners that influenced how Japanese understood their enemies. Japanese propagandists often underestimated Allied soldiers, viewing them as weak, decadent, and lacking in fighting spirit, assumptions that leaflet content reflected and that led to miscalculations about what would affect Allied morale. The racist stereotypes meant that Japanese didn't seriously study or try to understand the actual cultures and psychology of their enemies, assuming instead that their racial prejudices accurately captured enemy characteristics. This intellectual laziness or ideological blindness prevented Japanese psychological warfare from developing the cultural intelligence that would have been necessary for effectiveness. The evolution of Japanese leaflet content throughout the war reflected changing Japanese strategic situations and evolving understandings of the war's progress. Early in the war, when Japan was advancing and winning victories, leaflets emphasized Japanese military superiority and the futility of Allied resistance. As the war turned against Japan and Allied forces began their advance across the Pacific, leaflet content shifted to emphasize the casualties Allies were suffering and to suggest that even though Japan might lose eventually, the cost of Allied victory would be unacceptably high. Near the war's end, some Japanese leaflets took on almost desperate tones, still trying to encourage surrender or demoralization, but with increasingly obvious awareness that Japan was losing. The content evolution showed that Japanese propagandists were receiving feedback about the war's progress, but were never able to develop effective psychological warfare methods, even as they adapted themes to changing circumstances. The specific examples of Japanese leaflet content that Allied soldiers found particularly laughable or counterproductive illustrate the cultural gulf between Japanese propagandists and their intended audiences. One famous leaflet showed a woman in revealing clothing with text suggesting that this was what soldiers' wives were doing while they were away fighting, a theme that many soldiers found insulting to their families rather than demoralizing. Another leaflet attempted to exploit American democracy by suggesting that soldiers were fighting for politicians who didn't care about them, a theme that might have resonated in a society where military service was resented, but that largely failed with American soldiers, who generally supported their country's war effort. Leaflets that tried to emphasize Japanese cultural or spiritual superiority baffled Allied soldiers who didn't share or understand the cultural references and who generally viewed Japanese ideology as alien and dangerous rather than attractive. The technical analysis of Japanese leaflets as physical artifacts reveals interesting details about Japanese propaganda production capabilities and priorities. The paper quality varied considerably, with some leaflets printed on relatively good paper, while others used poor quality materials, reflecting Japanese resource constraints as the war progressed. The printing quality ranged from professional to crude, with some leaflets showing sophisticated design and production, while others appeared rushed and poorly executed. The artwork in leaflets sometimes showed talent and skill, with illustrations that were technically competent even when the content themes were culturally tone-deaf. The language used in English-language leaflets often contained grammatical errors or awkward phrasings that made the leaflets seem less credible and that sometimes made them unintentionally humorous to English-speaking soldiers. The post-war study of Japanese propaganda leaflets by historians and psychologists has contributed to understanding of psychological warfare effectiveness and of cultural factors in propaganda. Scholars analyzing Japanese leaflets have identified them as classic examples of propaganda failure due to cultural misunderstanding, using them as case studies in how not to conduct psychological warfare. The leaflets provide evidence for theories about propaganda requiring cultural intelligence and audience understanding to be effective. They illustrate how projecting your own values and assumptions onto enemies who don't share them leads to ineffective or counterproductive psychological warfare. And they demonstrate that technical capability in propaganda production, the ability to create and distribute materials, is necessary but not sufficient for effectiveness without the cultural insight to create resonant content. The collection and preservation of Japanese propaganda leaflets has created valuable historical resources now held in archives in museums around the world. Allied intelligence services collected thousands of Japanese leaflets during the war, creating collections that are now available to researchers. Individual soldiers kept leaflets as souvenirs, and these personal collections have sometimes been donated to institutions or sold to collectors, creating distributed archives of Japanese propaganda materials. Museums dedicated to Pacific War history often display Japanese leaflets as examples of wartime propaganda and psychological warfare. Digital archives have made many Japanese leaflets available online, allowing researchers and interested public to examine them and to study Japanese psychological warfare efforts. The influence of Japanese leaflet propaganda on post-war Japanese understanding of the Pacific War and of propaganda effectiveness is an interesting dimension of the story. In post-war Japan, there was generally little serious examination of the failures of Japanese psychological warfare, with more attention paid to military defeats and to the broader causes of Japan's loss in World War II. The cultural assumptions and prejudices that undermined Japanese propaganda effectiveness reflected broader aspects of Japanese wartime ideology that were largely rejected in post-war Japan, making the propaganda materials somewhat embarrassing reminders of wartime thinking. However, some Japanese scholars and historians have studied wartime propaganda, including leaflets, as part of broader examinations of Japanese wartime media and information operations, contributing to Japanese understanding of how propaganda functioned during the war. The lessons from Japanese leaflet propaganda about cultural intelligence in psychological warfare remain relevant for modern information operations and propaganda campaigns. The fundamental lesson that propaganda requires deep understanding of target audience psychology and culture is as applicable now as it was during World War II. Modern information warfare faces similar challenges of cultural difference and of avoiding the trap of projecting one's own values onto enemies or targets who don't share them. The failure of Japanese leaflets demonstrates that no amount of technical sophistication in creating and distributing propaganda can compensate for lack of cultural insight into what will actually affect target audiences. These lessons inform current military and intelligence services approaches to psychological operations and to information warfare more broadly. This is the hidden story of the Japanese leaflets that tried to break Allied morale, but that instead revealed how cultural misunderstanding can doom psychological warfare to failure. The millions of leaflets showing beautiful women and suggesting infidelity, warning of death and suffering, promising humane treatment if soldiers surrendered, all themes that Japanese propagandists believed would demoralize Allied forces, but that actually amused or angered the soldiers who found them. The crude propaganda that underestimated Allied determination and that projected Japanese values onto enemies who didn't share them. The leaflets became souvenirs and curiosities rather than demoralizing messages, turned into toilet paper rather than instruments of psychological manipulation. The Japanese leaflets demonstrated that in warfare, as in all human conflict, understanding your enemy is as important as understanding yourself, that assuming others think as you do is a path to strategic failure, and that sometimes the best propaganda your enemy can produce is evidence of how little they understand about who you are and what you're fighting for.
If this deep dive into how Japanese leaflets tried to break Allied morale but failed captivated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised by how ineffective Japanese propaganda was? Can you see connections between World War II's psychological warfare failures and modern propaganda or information warfare mistakes? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? How other Axis powers conducted psychological warfare? The role of cultural understanding in effective propaganda? Failed intelligence operations due to cultural misunderstanding? Share this video with anyone fascinated by Pacific War history, psychological warfare, propaganda studies, or the hidden stories of how cultural differences shape conflict outcomes. Until then, remember, sometimes the most revealing propaganda is that which fails, showing us not what works, but how little an enemy understands about who we are. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.